wind on Shadow Ridge had a voice. It wasn't a whisper, not a gentle sigh that rustled through pines. It was a low, guttural moan that clawed its way down from the peaks, carrying with it a payload of ice and fury. The sleet didn't fall. It flew sideways, a swarm of angry hornets that stung any exposed patch of skin. For most, it was a day to huddle by the hearth, to thank God for sturdy walls and a good roof. For May Callahan, it was just Tuesday. She rode a bay gelding named Jasper, a beast with a deep chest and an intelligent eye that understood the subtle shifts of his rider's weight better than most men understood words. His coat, normally the color of rich mahogany, was dark with moisture, and tiny crystals of ice clung to his mane and the coarse hairs of his ears. He moved with a steady, ground-eating gait, his shoulders bunched with effort, yet he never faltered. He trusted the hands on his reins. Those hands, encased in worn leather gloves, were as steady as his pace. They belonged to a woman who seemed carved from the same unforgiving landscape she traversed. May Callahan was not a large woman, but she carried herself with a stillness that took up space, huddled in a heavy, oilcloth duster that was more patch than original material, with a sodden felt hat pulled low over her brow. She could have been mistaken for a boy from a distance, but there was no mistaking the resolute set of her jaw or the straight, unbending line of her spine. It was a posture that had been tested and refused to break. On her hip, the worn walnut grip of a Colt peacemaker was a familiar weight, a cold and constant companion. It wasn't worn for show. It was a tool, like the skinning knife in her saddlebag or the steel will in her heart. Slung across her other side was a tattered leather satchel, its surface cracked and scarred like an old map. It held little of value to anyone but her: a change of linen, a half-eaten twist of jerky, a whetstone, and a bundle of oilskin-wrapped papers that were the only proof she existed beyond rumor. Shadow Ridge was the 4th town in 2 years. The first, Harmony Creek, had asked her to leave after she'd spoken her mind to a land baron who thought a woman's opinion was best kept with her sewing. The second, Redemption Gulch, had run her out on a rail of gossip after she'd won a horse race against the mayor's son and refused to pretend it was a fluke. The third, Prosperity, had been the worst. That was where the fire had happened. The memory was a ghost that rode pillion, its icy breath on her neck even in the heat of summer, the scent of smoke, the crackle of old timber turning to ash, the screams of penned-in animals, an accusation that clung to her like soot, a blaze she hadn't set but had walked out of when others hadn't. They'd called her a demon, a witch, a creature without a woman's soft heart. She had never offered a word in her own defense. Explaining felt like a plea for acceptance, and May had stopped seeking that long ago. It was a currency she couldn't afford and no longer desired. So, she had ridden away before the marshal could decide whether the whispers were enough to justify a rope. Now, the wind shrieked a high, lonesome note, and through the driving sleet, the first shapes of Shadow Ridge materialized. They weren't much, a handful of wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth, their shoulders hunched against the storm. A general store, a blacksmith's forge whose chimney was mercifully pluming smoke, a saloon with a swinging sign that creaked a mournful rhythm, and a livery barn that looked like it might stand until the next strong gust. It was enough. She didn't hope for a welcome. She didn't expect a warm bed or a friendly face. Hope was a dangerous luxury, a fire that could burn you from the inside out when it was extinguished. Her expectations were pared down to the bone, simple and practical. A dry stall and a measure of oats for Jasper. For herself, a roof, any roof. The lee side of a wall. A space in the hayloft. An overhang on a porch. Just a place where the wind couldn't find her for a few hours. A brief armistice in a long and lonely war. As she urged Jasper down the town's single, muddy street, she felt the eyes on her. Windows became frames for curious, wary faces. A curtain in the mercantile twitched. A man hurrying from the assayer's office to the saloon paused, pulling his collar tight. his gaze lingering on the strange, solitary rider. May was used to the stares. They were the preamble to the whispers, and the whispers were the prelude to the shunning. It was a pattern as predictable as the seasons. She met the stares without flinching, her gaze as cold and hard as the sleet that peppered her hat. She pulled Jasper to a halt before the livery. The wide double doors were closed against the storm, but a smaller side door was likely unlocked. She swung a leg over the saddle, her movement stiff from the cold but efficient. She landed in the sucking mud with a soft squelch, her boots sinking an inch. For a moment, she stood there, her hand resting on Jasper's neck, offering a silent reassurance. She could feel the tremors of exhaustion running through the horse's powerful frame. He had carried her far, and he deserved his rest. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice a low rasp. "Unused for hours. Almost there. Hay and warmth. I promise." Her own needs could wait. The horse came first. Always. It was a simple code, one of the few she still lived by. Men could lie, towns could turn on you, and the sky could fall. But a good horse would carry you through the gates of hell if you asked it to and treated it right. With a final, proprietary pat on his neck, she took the reins and led him toward the side door, her steps measured and deliberate. The mud tried to claim her boots. The wind tried to tear the hat from her head, and the cold tried to seep into her very bones. But May Callahan kept walking. She was a woman forged in storms, both inside and out, and as she pushed open the heavy wooden door to the livery, stepping from the screaming wind into the sudden, blessed quiet of a world that smelled of hay, manure, and warm animals, she brought the storm in with her. She carried it in the weariness of her eyes, in the scars on her knuckles, and in the silence that surrounded her like a shroud. She didn't know it yet, but Shadow Ridge was a town that knew a thing or two about storms. It was a place built on a precipice, waiting for either the sun to break through or for the whole damn ledge to crumble into the canyon below. And May Callahan, whether she intended to or not, was about to become the deciding factor. After settling Jasper in a dry, spacious stall with a generous portion of oats and fresh water, May Callahan pushed the livery door open and stepped back into the gale. The brief respite had made the cold feel even more personal, a deliberate assault on her senses. She pulled the collar of her duster tighter, the stiff, cold fabric scratching against her chin, and walked toward the only building that seemed to exude any real warmth or Life McKellen's saloon. The sign above the bat-wing doors, depicting a frothing beer stein swung on tortured hinges, its rhythmic squeal a counterpoint to the wind's chaotic howl. Light, yellow and thick with smoke, bled from the windows, promising a heat that was more than just physical. It promised company, noise and whiskey, three things that could be either a comfort or a curse, depending on the night. May expected the latter. She paused on the boardwalk, stamping the thickest of the mud from her boots. It was a token gesture, but one of habit. You didn't carry the trail into another man's establishment if you could help it. It was a matter of principle. Then, with a breath that plumed white in the frigid air, she pushed through the doors. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A wave of hot, stale air, thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap liquor, and frying bacon, washed over her. But more profound than the change in temperature was the change in sound. The saloon had been a hive of noise, a rumbling bass of male conversation, punctuated by the sharp clack of a billiard ball and the off-key plinking of an untended piano in the corner. The moment May's silhouette filled the doorway, all of it ceased. The conversations died mid-word. The man holding the pool cue froze, his arm extended. The bartender, a portly man with a magnificent mustache, stopped wiping a glass, his hand hovering in mid-air. Silence descended. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, woven from dozens of pairs of eyes. They took her in from the muddy boots to the battered hat, lingering on the oilcloth duster that did nothing to hide the lean, hard lines of her frame, and settling, inevitably, on the butt of the Colt resting on her hip. She was an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order of things. A woman, alone, armed, and walking into a saloon in the teeth of a blizzard as if she owned the place. May let the doors swing shut behind her. She stood for a long second, her eyes, the color of a winter sky just before it snows, sweeping the room. She wasn't cataloging threats. Not exactly. She was absorbing the atmosphere, gauging the collective mood, and letting them have their look. Let them stare. Staring couldn't break bones. Her gaze passed over faces hardened by sun and wind, men whose lives were etched in the lines around their eyes, prospectors with the feverish glint of gold lust still in their expressions, cowhands nursing beers after a long day, a few grim-faced ranchers talking land and cattle prices. Their expressions ranged from simple, bovine curiosity to open, sneering hostility. This was familiar territory. But then her eyes landed on a man seated alone at a table in the far corner, away from the stove's immediate heat. He was different. While every other man in the room was staring at her as if she were a two-headed calf, he was merely observing. He was tall, even sitting down, with a breadth of shoulder that his simple flannel shirt couldn't disguise. His face was angular, all planes and shadows under a dark, low-brimmed Stetson. He wasn't handsome in the way of a town banker or a slick gambler. His was a face shaped by the elements, weathered but not worn, with a mouth that looked like it hadn't smiled without good reason in a long time. As her gaze met his, he didn't look away, nor did his expression change. He simply, almost imperceptibly, touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. It wasn't a flirtation or a challenge. It was an acknowledgement. Asterisk, I see you. Nothing more. May broke the contact first, turning her attention to the bar. She walked the length of the room, her footsteps unnaturally loud on the sawdust-strewn floorboards. The silence held. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny on her back, a physical pressure. She ignored it, resting a gloved hand on the polished surface of the bar. The bartender finally seemed to remember how to move. He cleared his throat, his eyes flicking nervously toward her gun and then back to her face. "Ma'am?" he asked, the words sounding foreign in the aggressively masculine space. "Whiskey," May said. Her voice was low, slightly rough from the cold, but it carried in the unnatural quiet. "And leave the bottle." A low murmur rippled through the room. It was one thing for a woman to enter a saloon. It was another entirely for her to order whiskey like a man who planned on getting seriously, belligerently drunk. As the bartender turned to retrieve a bottle and a glass, a voice piped up from a table near the stove. "Well, look what the storm blew in. Kinda scrawny for a fella, and awful pretty for a horse thief." The voice belonged to a thick-necked man with a greasy beard and small, piggish eyes. He grinned, showing a landscape of yellowed teeth, clearly pleased with his own wit. A few sycophantic chuckles followed, breaking the tension and turning it into something uglier. The collective mood shifted from wariness to ridicule. May didn't turn. She kept her eyes fixed on the bartender as he placed the glass and a bottle of amber liquid in front of her. She methodically stripped off her gloves, revealing hands that were anything but pretty. They were capable hands, with short, clean nails and a network of fine, silvery scars across the knuckles. She poured a generous measure of whiskey into the glass. The man wasn't finished. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he slurred, emboldened by the laughter. "You lost, little lady, or did your husband finally get tired of that face and kick you out into the snow?" The laughter grew louder, coarser. Men nudged each other, their earlier caution forgotten. She was just a woman, after all, and a strange one at that. Fair game. May still didn't look at him. She lifted her glass, the smell of the cheap whiskey sharp and familiar. She was an island, and the laughter was just the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. It couldn't touch her. But she noticed something. Through the cacophony, she noticed that one person wasn't laughing. From the corner of her eye, she could see the man at the far table. He hadn't moved. His posture was relaxed, one hand resting on his knee, the other holding a cup of what was probably coffee. His face remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the loudmouth by the stove. He wasn't amused. He wasn't angry. He was just watching, waiting, a predator's stillness. Just as the man by the stove opened his mouth to deliver another insult, a voice cut through the room. It wasn't loud, but it had a quiet authority that commanded attention. "Storm's outside. Miss, don't bring it in here." It was the man from the corner table, Elijah Eli Rowe. Though May didn't know his name, he hadn't stood up. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't even looked at the heckler. He had spoken directly to her. The words hung in the air, simple, direct, and laden with a meaning that went far beyond the weather. The laughter sputtered and died, replaced once again by an expectant silence. The men turned to look at Eli, their expressions now a mixture of confusion and respect. Slowly, May turned her head. She didn't turn her body, just her head, fixing her gaze on him across the smoky room. His eyes were a deep, clear gray, like river stones underwater. They held no pity, no judgment, only a calm, steady appraisal. He was speaking to her as an equal, a fellow survivor. He saw the tempest she carried, the one she'd dragged in with her from the blizzard, the one that made men either fear her or mock her. He wasn't doing either. He was simply stating a fact and, perhaps, offering a piece of advice. She held his gaze for a long moment, the world narrowing to the space between their two tables. The fat bartender, the drunken lout, the curious faces, they all faded into the periphery. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own exhaustion, a weariness with the world's endless capacity for noise and stupidity. He understood. She lifted her glass in a small, almost imperceptible salute to him, then took a slow sip. The whiskey burned a clean, hot trail down her throat, chasing away some of the chill. When she lowered the glass, her eyes were still locked on his. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in the silent room. "It's already inside." The exchange in the saloon maze quiet, wounded defiance, and Eli's unexpected intervention settled over the room like a shroud. The loudmouth, deflated by Eli's quiet authority, mumbled into his beer and found a sudden interest in the floorboards. The moment had passed, the confrontation averted. But a seed had been planted in the fertile soil of small-town suspicion. By the next morning, the blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and silent, draped in a thick blanket of white. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. May Callahan had spent the night in the livery's hayloft. It wasn't warm, but it was dry, and the sweet smell of hay and the gentle sounds of the animals below were a comfort she preferred to any boarding house filled with curious stares. But while the storm outside had died, the one inside Shadow Ridge was just beginning to brew. It started in the general store, as most things did. Martha O'Connell, a woman whose piety was matched only by her insatiable curiosity, was measuring out beans for a rancher when she leaned in conspiratorially. "Did you see her? Silas, the woman who came in last night," she said, her voice a stage whisper. "Walked right into McKellen's. They say, bold as brass." Silas, a man of few words, grunted. "Saw her right in. Looks like she's seen hard miles." "Hard miles and hard living, I'd wager." Martha sniffed. "Carries a pistol like a man, and those eyes, cold enough to freeze hell over. My Henry says she ordered a bottle of whiskey and didn't say another word all night." The story, a simple, factual account, was the nucleus around which the legends would crystallize. By the time it reached the blacksmith's forge, carried by Silas, it had gained a new detail. "Carries a man's gun, and they say she stared down Tom Finney without so much as a blink after he spoke to her. Tom said it was like looking at a wolf." Jebediah, the blacksmith, a man whose powerful arms were matched by a powerful imagination, hammered a glowing horseshoe and added his own flourish. "A wolf, humph. I heard from a fella over in Prosperity she's the one who burned down the old Miller barn. Fella said she did it for spite after Miller accused her of cheating at cards. And so it went. The tale grew with each telling, each person adding a layer of varnish, a darker shade of paint. By midday, May Callahan was no longer just a stranger. She was a myth, a cautionary tale whispered over fence posts and coffee cups. They say her horse dragged her husband's body for 3 days through the desert before she cut him loose. I heard she was run out of Redemption Gulch for shooting at a preacher, said his sermon was too long-winded. Someone told me she ain't a woman at all, just a spirit of the storm. May heard the whispers. It was impossible not to. When she walked to the mercantile to buy a small sack of flour and some coffee, the conversation would halt, only to resume in hushed, urgent tones the moment her back was turned. She felt their eyes on her, a constant, prickling scrutiny. They watched the way she walked, the way she held her head, the calloused, scarred state of her hands when she counted out her coins. She was coming out of the store, the small sack tucked under her arm, when she heard Martha O'Connell's voice from the boardwalk, pitched to Carrie, and I wouldn't let my children anywhere near the likes of her. A woman like that is nothing but trouble, pure trouble. May didn't stop. She didn't turn, but a flicker of something, a shadow of an old, deep pain, crossed her face before being instantly suppressed. It was replaced by the faintest of smiles. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a thin, bitter curve of the lips that acknowledged the world's verdict and dismissed it in the same breath. She had been called trouble before. She had been called far worse. Denying it would be a waste of breath. Explaining would be an act of supplication. She would do neither. She simply pulled her hat a little lower and walked on, her spine as straight and unyielding as a fence post in winter. From across the street, leaning against a support beam of the assayer's office, Eli Rowe watched her. He had heard the stories, too. They were impossible to avoid, a plague of words infecting the town. He'd listened to Jebediah's fantastical account at the forge and had heard the whispers in the saloon. They flowed around him, but none of it seemed to stick. Eli was a man who trusted his eyes above all else. Rumors were just noise, the idle chatter of people who had too much time and not enough to do. What he saw was something different. He saw a woman who had spent the better part of the morning meticulously grooming her horse, checking his hooves for stones and rubbing him down with a burlap sack until his coat shone, all in the biting cold of the open livery door. He saw her refuse the stable owner's offer of a hot meal, paying instead for a dipper of coffee and breaking off a piece of her own hardtack. He saw her now, walking back toward the livery, choosing the cold solitude of the barn over the stifling, judgmental warmth of the town. She didn't ask for help. She didn't ask for sympathy. She stood outside, in the wind, when there were warm stoves she could be standing near. It wasn't pride, he reckoned. Not the foolish kind. It was something deeper. It was the ingrained habit of a creature that has learned that warmth often comes with a cage, that help often comes with strings, and that the only thing you could ever truly rely on was the strength in your own 2 hands. He understood that language better than any rumor. His ranch, a sprawling piece of land a few miles out of town, had taken a beating in the storm. A section of the stable roof had been torn loose, and a length of corral fence was flattened. He needed a hand, someone who wasn't afraid of hard work. He could have hired any of a dozen idle men in town, but a different idea had taken root. He pushed himself off the post and crossed the muddy street, his long-legged stride eating up the distance. He didn't call out to her. He simply fell into step a few paces behind her until she sensed his presence and stopped, her hand instinctively dropping to rest near the grip of her pistol. She turned, her body angled slightly, ready for anything. Her eyes were wary, questioning. "Ma'am," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. He touched the brim of his hat, the same simple gesture from the night before. "Cowboy," she replied, her tone flat, non-committal. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. The storm took a piece of my stable roof, snapped a few support beams. 2. It's a 2-man job, but I'm only 1 man. She watched him, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, waiting for the point. I need someone who can tell one end of a hammer from the other, he continued, his voice calm and even. Someone who isn't afraid to be on a roof in the cold. The livery owner says you paid for your stall for the week, but that hayloft can't be much warmer than the ground. I'm offering a job. Room and board for you and your horse, plus fair wages for your time. The work's temporary, just till the stables sound again. May's eyes narrowed slightly. She searched his face for the trick, for the hint of pity, or the leering suggestion that so often accompanied offers of help from men. She found neither. His gaze was direct, his expression serious. He wasn't offering charity, he was offering a transaction. He had a problem, and he thought she might be the solution. It was an assessment of her capability, not her gender or her situation. It was, in its own way, the first honest sign of respect she'd been shown since riding into this part of the country. Still, she hesitated. Trust was a foreign country she hadn't visited in years. "Why me?" she asked, her voice low. "Town's full of men looking for work." Eli's gaze didn't waver. He gave a slight shrug of his broad shoulders. "Maybe," he said, "but I figure anyone who rides into a blizzard like yesterday's and orders whiskey neat isn't likely to be scared off by a little wind and some splintered timber. The question isn't why I'm asking you. It's whether or not you're interested." He stood there, patient, letting the offer settle. He wasn't pressing her. The choice was hers, for the first time in a long time. Someone was giving her a choice that wasn't simply leave or be thrown out. She looked past him, at the town that was already judging and condemning her, and then back at the man standing before her. He wasn't looking at the trouble everyone else saw. He was looking at her hands, which were still clutching the small sack of flour, and he was seeing a worker. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she gave a single, sharp nod. "I can handle a hammer." The ride to Eli Rowe's ranch was a silent one. May rode Jasper a few paces behind him, a position that felt both subordinate and strategic. It allowed her to watch him, to study the easy way he sat his horse, a powerful gray that moved with the fluid grace of a river current. He didn't look back, didn't try to fill the silence with idle chatter. He simply led the way, a steady, confident presence against the vast, snow-covered landscape. His property was nestled in a wide basin, protected on one side by a high, timbered ridge that gave the town its name. It wasn't a grand operation, but it was solid. A well-kept, modest ranch house with a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, several long cattle sheds, and a series of sturdy-looking corrals. And then there was the stable. It was a large, well-built structure, or had been. The storm had peeled back a section of the roof as if opening a tin can, and one of the main support posts had splintered under the weight of the snow, causing the whole north corner to sag dangerously. Eli swung down from his gray and gestured toward the damaged building. "There she is," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Wind came over the ridge just right. Sounded like a train coming through." May dismounted, her eyes already assessing the damage. She walked the perimeter of the stable, her boots crunching in the snow. She ran a gloved hand over the splintered post, her touch surprisingly gentle, as if listening to the wood story of its own breaking. She looked up at the gaping hole in the roof, calculating angles and stresses. She was no longer a mysterious drifter. She was a craftswoman evaluating a piece of work. Eli watched her, his arms crossed over his chest. He saw the focus in her eyes, the way her mind was clearly working behind the still mask of her face. He had taken a gamble, offering a job to a complete stranger with a reputation that was growing darker by the hour. But something in the way she'd met his gaze in the saloon, something in her quiet self-possession, had spoken to him more clearly than any town gossip. "I'll need to brace that main beam before we touch anything else," she said, her voice cutting through the crisp air. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. If it goes, it'll take the whole wall with it. Eli just nodded. Tools are in the workshop. The next few days fell into a rhythm dictated by work, weather, and the slow winter light. The world shrank to the dimensions of the damaged stable. The sounds that defined their existence were the crisp scrape of a handsaw through pine, the rhythmic report of two hammers driving nails, the low grunt of shared effort as they hoisted a new beam into place. On the first morning, Eli had passed her a hammer. It was a heavy, well-balanced tool, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark with use. May took it, and the way her fingers closed around it told him everything he needed to know. It was not a foreign object to her. She hefted it once, testing its weight, and then turned to the task of securing a temporary brace. Her first swing was a short, sharp crack. The nailhead, held between the scarred fingers of her other hand, vanished an inch into the thick timber. The second swing was longer, more fluid, a symphony of leverage and force that drove the nail home, its head perfectly flush with the surface of the wood. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Eli found himself pausing his own work to watch. He had worked with dozens of men in his life, and he could count on one hand the number who could drive a nail with such clean, efficient power. He looked at her hands. They were, as he'd noticed before, cross-hatched with the fine, pale lines of old injuries. These weren't the scars of a single, dramatic event. They were the accumulated history of labor, of slips of a chisel, of encounters with rough-sawn lumber, of a life lived by hand. The town saw a dangerous woman. He saw a survivor. Their conversation started small, born from the work itself. "This lumber is green," she commented one afternoon, running her thumb over the end of a freshly cut board. "It'll warp when it dries." "It's what I've got," Eli replied, not defensively. "Best we can do is brace it tight and hope for the best. If you seat the nails at a slight angle, it'll help hold it truer," she said, and then demonstrated, her hammer falling with practiced precision. He watched, learned, and nodded his thanks. They talked about the wind, the way it moved through the canyons, and how you could predict a storm by the color of the sky over the peaks. They talked about horses, the merits of different bloodlines, the best way to treat a cracked hoof. They spoke of the practical, tangible world that surrounded them, a world of wood and steel, of animal instinct and changing seasons. It was a safe language, a way of taking each other's measure without ever asking a personal question. In the quiet spaces between the hammer blows, a fragile trust was being built, plank by plank, nail by nail. May discovered that Eli's silence was not one of judgment, but of observation. He moved with an economy of motion that she recognized in herself. He didn't speak unless he had something to say. He worked hard, his powerful frame making light of tasks that would exhaust other men. Yet he never once commented on her own strength as if it were a novelty. He simply accepted it, making room for it, working with it. For the first time in years, she felt like a partner, not a spectacle. Late on the third day, the winter sun was bleeding its last orange light across the snow, casting long, blue shadows. They had finished framing the last section of the roof and had paused, their breath misting in the cooling air, to look at their handiwork. Aches had settled deep into their bones, the good, honest ache of a day's hard labor. Eli passed her a tin cup of coffee he'd fetched from the house, its warmth a welcome shock against her cold fingers. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound the distant lowing of cattle. It was in this quiet moment of shared accomplishment that the walls inside May trembled. She had been shown a kindness without condition, a respect without preamble, and it was a more disarming thing than any threat. She felt a sudden, sharp need to warn him, to lay the truth of her reputation at his feet before this fragile peace could be shattered by something worse. "I'm trouble, you know." The words were quiet, spoken to the half-empty coffee cup she held in her scarred hands. It was a confession, a test, and a dare, all rolled into one. She didn't look at him, bracing herself for the shift in his posture, the sudden caution in his eyes, the polite but firm withdrawal that always followed such an admission. Eli was silent for a long moment. He took a slow sip of his own coffee, his eyes on the darkening ridgeline. She could feel his gaze on her, though steady and thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and carried a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. He chuckled. It wasn't a laugh, but a soft, genuine sound in the back of his throat. A small, wry grin touched the corners of his mouth. "Good," he said, finally turning his head to look at her directly. "Trouble knows how to survive storms." May froze. Her breath caught somewhere in her chest. Of all the reactions she had expected disbelief, fear, morbid curiosity, polite dismissal, this was not one of them. He hadn't just dismissed her warning. He had taken the word the world used as a brand against her trouble and reframed it as a badge of honor. He saw it not as a character flaw, but as a survival trait, a sign of strength. She slowly lifted her head, her gaze meeting his across the twilight, the wariness in her eyes, the hard, protective shell she'd worn for so long, flickered. For the first time, she saw past the quiet cowboy, the competent rancher. She saw a man who looked at a splintered, broken thing and didn't see the damage. He saw the good wood underneath and knew how to make it whole again. Or maybe, even better, he didn't feel the need to fix it at all. He was content to stand beside it, hammer in hand, and help it mend itself. A feeling she couldn't name, a strange and unfamiliar warmth, spread through her chest. It was frightening, but it was not unwelcome. She said nothing more, but as they turned to put the tools away for the night, the silence that fell between them was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the beginning of a shared peace. The stable was a world of its own after dark. During the day, it was a place of work, of sweat and sawdust, a structure of timber and nails they were slowly healing. But at night, it became a cavernous sanctuary, a vast, breathing darkness filled with the soft rustle of animals in their stalls, the sweet-scented dust of hay, and the constant low moan of the wind probing at the newly patched roof. It was a lonely sound, the voice of the wilderness reminding them of their isolation. May sat on an upturned crate, her back against a sturdy support post. She had built a small, careful fire in a clearing on the dirt floor, its flames a tiny, defiant heart of warmth in the immense cold. The firelight danced, throwing long, distorted shadows that writhed and leaped up the walls to the high, dark rafters. It was her only companion, and it was not enough. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that stalked the edges of the firelight. It seeped up from the frozen earth, radiated from the stone foundations, and found its way through the smallest gaps in the walls. It was a deep, biting cold that seemed to work its way into the marrow of her bones. She had her duster wrapped tightly around her, but its protection was thin. She held her hands out to the flames, turning them over and over, but her fingers remained numb, the joints aching with a cold that fire alone couldn't seem to touch. It was in these quiet, unguarded hours that the ghosts came. Not the whispers of the townspeople, those were easy to ignore. Just noise on the wind. These were the real ghosts, the memory of her father's grim disappointment, the face of the young man in Redemption Gulch who had called her an unnatural woman, the acrid smell of smoke and the blinding panic of the fire in Prosperity. They crowded around her, their voices indistinguishable from the wind's howl, whispering the same old accusations. Trouble, unwomanly, cursed. She drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, trying to make herself a smaller target for the cold and the memories. She had learned long ago that solitude was safety. People were the tinder, the fuel for the fires that had so often consumed her life. Being alone meant there was nothing to burn. Yet, tonight, The safety of solitude felt indistinguishable from the prison of loneliness. Working alongside Eli, she had felt a flicker of something else, a partnership, a shared purpose. Now, with the work done for the day, the silence he left behind was heavier than it had been before. She didn't hear him approach. The soft dirt floor and the sighing of the wind muffled his footsteps. One moment she was alone with her ghosts. The next, a large shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness by the main doors. Her body went rigid, her hand dropping to her side, her fingers brushing the cold, familiar grip of her Colt. But it was only Eli. He stood there for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, not wanting to startle her further. He carried no lantern. The firelight was enough for him to navigate by. In one hand, he held 2 steaming tin cups. Under his other arm was a thick, heavy bundle. He didn't speak. He simply walked over and placed one of the cups on the crate next to her before taking a seat on a nearby hay bale, just outside the immediate circle of her fire. Then, he unrolled the bundle and tossed it to her. It landed softly in her lap. A heavy, sheepskin-lined coat, his own. It was still warm from his body, and it smelled faintly of leather, wood smoke, and the clean, cold scent of the outdoors. May looked from the coat to his face, a question in her eyes. "You'll freeze to death out here," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't an order or a judgment, just a simple statement of fact. She hesitated for only a second before slipping her arms into the coat. The warmth was immediate, a profound comfort that seemed to sink directly into her skin. The sheepskin lining was soft against her neck, and the sheer weight of the garment was grounding, a shield against the cavernous dark. She pulled it tight around herself, her numb fingers fumbling with the buttons. Eli watched her, then turned his attention to his own cup, cradling it in his large hands. The silence returned, but it had changed. It was no longer empty. It was occupied by the 2 of them, a shared space. They sat for what felt like an hour, maybe more. Time seemed to lose its meaning. The only rhythm was the crackle and hiss of the fire, the steady, soft breathing of the horses in their stalls, and the relentless, keening cry of the wind outside. May watched him in the flickering light. The fire carved his face from shadows, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the quiet intensity in his gray eyes as he stared into the flames. He was a man utterly at peace in the quiet. He demanded nothing from her, not conversation, not gratitude, nothing. He was simply present, and his presence was a strange and powerful thing. It pushed the ghosts back, forcing them to retreat to the darker corners of the barn. With him sitting there, they seemed less real, their whispers fading under the sound of the wind. The warmth of the coat, the hot coffee, and his steady presence worked a slow magic on her. The tension that had been a permanent resident in her shoulders began to ease. The knot of fear and defiance in her stomach loosened its grip. She found herself breathing more deeply, her gaze softening as she watched the hypnotic dance of the flames. He had called her trouble, a strength. He had offered her work instead of suspicion. And now he sat with her in the cold dark, offering his warmth without a word. It was too much to comprehend, and it unlodged the question that had been buried in her heart for years. "Why aren't you afraid of what I bring?" Her voice was so quiet it was almost lost to the wind. But he heard it. He turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers across the firelight. He didn't seem surprised by the question. He seemed, if anything, to have been expecting it. He looked away, his eyes finding the high, dark rafters where the shadows played. He considered his answer carefully, as if choosing the right piece of wood for a critical joint. "When I was a boy," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "my father took me up into the high country to check the cattle camps before winter set in. We got caught in a squall. Came on sudden. Wind that could tear the skin from your bones. Snow so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. It was the kind of storm that doesn't just kill you, it erases you, wipes you from the face of the earth." He paused, his eyes still distant, lost in the memory. May listened, her body perfectly still, holding her breath. We found a small cave, barely an overhang in the rocks. For 2 days, we huddled in there while the world screamed. All I could feel was fear. It was a living thing, a beast trying to claw its way inside me. But my father, he wasn't afraid. He was watchful. He was respectful. He told me, you don't fight a storm like that. You endure it. You find its center, and you hold on. He brought his gaze back from the rafters and settled it on her. His eyes were clear, and in their depths, she saw a profound and sorrowful understanding. I've seen storms that have flattened entire towns, he said, his voice dropping even lower. I've seen storms in men's hearts that have made them do terrible things. So no, I'm not afraid of the storm you bring with you. He held her gaze, and a flicker of something, a deep and abiding empathy, warmed his expression. Because I've seen worse storms, and some were beautiful once they passed. The words settled in the space between them, extinguishing the last of her ghosts. He saw her. He didn't just see the trouble, the reputation, the gun on her hip. He saw the storm itself, the wild and painful force that had shaped her. And he wasn't trying to tame it or run from it. He was offering to help her find the center, the quiet place where you could simply endure until it passed. And in that, he saw beauty. A tremor went through her, a shudder that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the breaking of a dam, the collapse of a wall she had spent a lifetime building. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek, hissing as it fell into the fire. Slowly, tentatively, she moved. She shifted on the crate, closing the small distance between them. Then, with a hesitant grace, she leaned sideways until her shoulder rested against his. His body was solid, warm, and unyielding as an old oak. He didn't flinch or stiffen at her touch. He simply accepted it, a silent acknowledgement of the gesture. He remained perfectly still, offering his strength as a bulwark against the night. May closed her eyes. For the first time she could remember, she wasn't braced for a blow. She wasn't ready to fight or to flee. She was just resting, leaning on another human being. The sensation was terrifying, and at the same time, it felt more like coming home than any place she had ever been. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the feeling of trust. She was just tired, and he was strong, and for now, in the heart of the lonely, howling dark. That was enough. The stable roof was whole again. The new pine timbers, pale against the weathered gray of the old wood, stood as a testament to a week of shared, relentless labor. A quiet rhythm had established itself between May and Eli. It was a routine built on the foundation of morning coffee brewed over an open fire. Long days of work that left their muscles aching with a clean fatigue, and evenings spent in the shared, comfortable silence of the stable. May had begun to sleep in the hayloft with a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. The ghosts of her past still whispered, but their voices were fainter now, often drowned out by the steady, living sounds of the ranch. The fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of the noon stagecoach. They had ridden into Shadow Ridge for supplies. It was the first time they had come to town together, and May was acutely aware of the stares that followed them. But this time, the whispers were different. The sight of her riding alongside Eli Rowe, a man respected for his quiet judgment and self-sufficiency, had given the townspeople pause. Their curiosity was now tinged with a grudging recalculation. Maybe the strange woman wasn't just trouble after all. They were just stepping out of the general store, Eli carrying a heavy sack of grain over his shoulder, and May a smaller parcel of coffee and salt. When the stagecoach rattled to a halt in a spray of muddy slush, the driver called out the town's name, and the door swung open. A few weary travelers disembarked, but it was the last man to emerge who made the world stop. He was dressed in a way that was alien to Shadow Ridge, a tailored city coat, polished boots that had never known a stirrup, and a bowler hat perched on a head of slick, dark hair. He was handsome in a way that made a person's teeth ache, with a smile that was all surface and no warmth. He stepped onto the boardwalk and surveyed the muddy street with an air of dismissive ownership, his eyes sweeping over the town as if it were a property he was considering for purchase. May froze. The parcel in her arms suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The blood in her veins turned to ice. Every muscle in her body locked, and the crisp winter air seemed to vanish from her lungs. She knew that smile. She knew the arrogant tilt of that head. It was a face from a nightmare, a ghost made of flesh and blood. Clay Maris. His eyes continued their sweep of the town, and then they found her. For a fraction of a second, a look of genuine surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by something else, a slow, cruel, and utterly triumphant smirk. He saw her, and in the same instant, he saw an opportunity. He tipped his hat not to her, but to the idea of her, a gesture of mocking theater. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice carrying easily across the street. It was a smooth, articulate voice, the kind that could make a lie sound like gospel. "May Callahan, of all the godforsaken mudholes in this country, I should have known I'd find you in a place like this." He started toward them, his polished boots making confident sounds on the wooden planks. People on the boardwalk stopped to watch, their curiosity piqued by the sudden drama. Eli, who had been a step ahead, had stopped when he felt May go rigid behind him. He turned, his gaze moving from her stark white face to the approaching stranger. He slowly lowered the grain sack to the ground, his posture shifting from that of a rancher to that of a sentinel. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes were watchful, missing nothing. Clay stopped a few feet from them, his smirk widening as he took in May's worn duster and the way her hand had unconsciously drifted toward her hip. "Still playing the wildcat, I see," he said, his eyes flicking to Eli with casual disdain before returning to her. "And you found yourself a protector. How quaint." May couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up. All she could hear was the crackle of fire, the roar in her ears that always came when this particular ghost appeared. This man was the architect of her exile, the one who had lit the match of rumor and then stood back to watch her life burn. "What's your business here, Mr.?" Eli's voice was low and even, devoid of any discernible emotion. Yet it was a solid wall of sound between Clay and May. Clay gave a dismissive laugh. "My business," he gestured grandly to the town. "My business is progress. I'm with the Union Pacific. We're surveying a route through these mountains, and it seems Shadow Ridge is directly in our path. We'll be buying up land, bringing in jobs, bringing civilization to this little backwater." He looked pointedly at May. "And with civilization comes the truth. It has a way of catching up to people, doesn't it? May." He took another step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hiss, meant for her but loud enough for Eli to hear. "The folks in Prosperity never did find out the real story of that fire. They just ran you out on suspicion. Perhaps it's time everyone in this town had the benefit of a first-hand account. I'd be happy to tell them all about you, about your temper, about what you're capable of when you feel you've been wronged." The threat was clear, delivered with the casual cruelty of a cat toying with a mouse. He would destroy her here, just as he had destroyed her there. He would paint her as the monster, and they would believe him, because he was a man of progress and importance, and she was just a piece of drifting trouble. The blood drained completely from her face. She looked pale and fragile, a stark contrast to the capable woman who had swung a hammer on his roof for a week. Eli saw it all. He saw the predator in Clay's eyes and the sheer, stark terror in hers. This was the storm she carried inside. He was finally seeing its face. He didn't need to know the details. The truth of the situation was written in their postures, in the air between them. He took a half-step forward, a subtle but unmistakable movement that placed him more fully in Clay's path. "I think your business with this lady is concluded," Eli said. His voice hadn't risen a decibel, but it now held a note of finality that was as cold and hard as river stone. Clay looked Eli up and down, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged, but he saw the unyielding strength in Eli's stance, the quiet confidence that promised no quarter. Clay preferred to fight his battles with words and whispers, not with fists against a man who looked like he was carved from the mountain itself. He gave another condescending smile. "For now," he said, his gaze locking with May's one last time. "We'll be in town for a while. We'll have plenty of time to get reacquainted." He tipped his hat again and turned, walking toward the saloon with the swagger of a man who believed he had already won. The moment he was gone, the strength seemed to go out of May's legs. The parcel slipped from her numb fingers, landing with a soft thud in the mud. She stared at the spot where he had stood, her breathing shallow and ragged. She was no longer in Shadow Ridge. She was back in the smoke, back in the courtroom of public opinion, with the heat of 100 accusatory stares on her skin. Without a word, Eli picked up her parcel, then the grain sack, hoisting it back onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He gently took her by the elbow. His touch was firm, grounding. "Let's go home," he said softly. She allowed him to lead her to the horses, her movements stiff and mechanical. The ride back to the ranch was shrouded in a thick, heavy silence. The easy peace they had built was gone, replaced by the suffocating presence of her past. She expected him to ask. She waited for the questions, for the doubt to creep into his voice, for the inevitable moment when he would look at her and see what everyone else saw. They reached the ranch and wordlessly unsaddled the horses. It wasn't until they were standing in the cold, quiet air of the stable, the very place they had forged their fragile bond, that he finally spoke. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the snow. He didn't face her directly, but stood beside her, both of them looking out at the vast, empty landscape. "The things he'll say about you," Eli began, his voice quiet, careful. "About that fire. Is it true?" May's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment of judgment. She couldn't bring herself to speak the words, to give voice to the accusation that had haunted her for so long. All she could do was give a single, miserable nod. Asterisk. "Yes. It's true that he'll say those things. It's true that's what they accused me of." It was an admission of the story, not the crime, but she knew how it would sound. She braced herself, waiting for him to step away. Instead, he was silent for a long beat. He turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes clear and steady. There was no anger in them, no suspicion, only a deep, unwavering calm. "Then let him talk," Eli said, his voice soft but absolute. "You'll still be standing when he's gone." Clay Maris's presence settled over Shadow Ridge like a foul smog, tainting the clean mountain air. He was a man skilled in the art of influence, and within 2 days, he had woven himself into the town's small tapestry of power. He bought rounds of drinks at the saloon, spoke of prosperity and land values with the ranchers, and charmed the mayor's wife with polished city manners. All the while, the poison of his whispers about May Callahan seeped into the community. He never told the full story, just offered tantalizing, damning fragments. A tragic history, that one, a woman of fiery passions, best to keep your distance. The change was palpable. The tentative respect May had begun to earn curdled back into suspicion. The gazes that followed her were once again hostile, now colored with the lurid details of Clay's insinuations. She and Eli worked in a bubble of self-imposed isolation on his ranch, but the outside world pressed in, cold and heavy. It was during their sparse evening meal a few days after Clay's arrival that Eli made the announcement. He looked at her across the small wooden table in his ranch house, his expression serious. "Mayor Thompson is holding a dinner tomorrow night," he said, his voice even, "for Mr. Maris, to discuss the railroad's proposals. The mayor invited me as one of the principal landowners, and he said I should bring a guest." May stopped eating, her fork hovering over her plate, a cold dread. familiar and sharp, twisted in her gut. Eli, no. He's going to be there, May, Eli stated. Not as an argument, but as a fact they both had to face. He'll be the guest of honor. He'll have the ear of every important person in this town. He'll spend the entire evening poisoning the well. And you'll be out here, hiding. The whispers will just get louder. Let them, she said, her voice tight. I don't care what these people think. I know you don't, he replied, his gaze unwavering. But this isn't about them. This is about him. You can't let him own the story. May, you can't let him chase you out of this valley the same way he's chased you out of every other place. Hiding is what he expects. It's what makes his lies stick. He leaned forward slightly. I'm asking you to come with me. The thought of it was physically nauseating. To walk into a room full of people who already saw her as a pariah. To sit at a table with the man who had authored her ruin. To endure their stares and his smug, triumphant smile, it was a form of torture she couldn't imagine enduring. But then she looked at Eli. He wasn't asking her to be someone she wasn't. He was asking her to be exactly who she was, a survivor. The woman who could face a storm and not break. He was offering her a chance not to run, but to stand. All right, Eli, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. I'll go. The next evening, she stood before the small, cracked mirror in the ranch house's spare room. She had washed the trail dust from her hair, and it hung dark and heavy past her shoulders. She wore her only other set of clothes, a simple, dark blue work dress, patched at the elbows but scrupulously clean. It was a garment of severe practicality, with no lace, no frills. It was the armor of a woman who had no use for ornamentation. Looking at her reflection, she saw the same haunted eyes, the same grim set of her mouth. She still looked like trouble. When she emerged, Eli was waiting. He was dressed in a clean shirt and a string tie, his usual ruggedness replaced by a quiet, formal dignity. He didn't offer any false compliments. He just looked at her for a long moment, his eyes taking in her stark simplicity, and gave a single, approving nod. You're ready. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she nodded back. As I'll ever be. The mayor's house was the grandest in town, with glass windows and a wide, welcoming porch. As they stepped inside, the warmth and light were a physical shock, and so was the silence. The room was full of the town's most prominent citizens, the Thompsons, the mercantile owner and his wife, the town's doctor, several ranchers. They were all in mid-conversation, a cheerful hum of polite society. The moment May crossed the threshold on Eli's arm, the hum vanished. It was as if a switch had been thrown. Every head turned, every conversation stopped. They looked at her as if she were a cougar that had just wandered into a church social. The women's eyes were cold and sharp, raking over her plain dress and scarred hands. The men's expressions were a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. May felt the blood rush to her face, a hot tide of shame and anger. She instinctively took a half-step back, her fight-or-flight instinct screaming at her to turn and run back into the honest cold of the night. Then, she felt Eli's hand on the small of her back, a firm, steady, reassuring pressure. It wasn't a gesture of ownership. It was a silent message, asterisk. I am here. You are not alone. Bolstered by that simple touch, she lifted her chin, met the hostile stares with a cool gaze of her own, and walked with him into the room. The evening was an agony of polite endurance. May sat beside Eli at the long dining table, a silent, watchful ghost at the feast. The conversation flowed around her, a river in which she could not swim, and holding court at the head of the table, next to the mayor, was Clay Maris. He was in his element, charming, witty, and expansive. He spoke of tracks and engines, of land grants and the inevitable march of progress, making it all sound like a grand and glorious adventure. He largely ignored May, a calculated cruelty that was more effective than any direct insult. He treated her as if she were a piece of furniture, an insignificant detail in the room, but every so often, his eyes would flick to her, a small, knowing smirk playing on his lips, a silent reminder that he held all the power here. May kept her gaze fixed on her plate, her hands clenched in her lap. She focused on Eli's presence beside her, the solid warmth of his shoulder near hers. She would endure. She would be the stone in the river, and this too would pass over her. It was during dessert, over apple pie and coffee, that Clay made his move. He had been telling an amusing, self-deprecating story about his first encounter with frontier justice in a mining camp. The table laughed along with him. Then, his expression grew more serious. "It's a wild country," he said, his gaze sweeping the table before landing, with deliberate weight, on May. "It breeds a certain kind of person, passionate, unpredictable, people who live by their own rules. I saw it myself, back in Prosperity." The room grew quiet. The name of the town hung in the air. A terrible tragedy there. Clay continued, shaking his head with mock sadness. "A barn fire. A terrible, terrible waste. It's amazing what a single person can do when they feel they've been slighted. The fury they can unleash. Some people are just storms walking on two legs. You never know when they'll break." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Every eye in the room darted to May. It was a masterful assassination, performed with a surgeon's blade of innuendo. He had convicted her without an accusation. May felt the room begin to spin, the air growing thick and hard to breathe. This was how he did it, not with a shout, but with a whisper. She could feel Eli tense beside her, ready to speak, ready to defend her. But in that moment, something inside her shifted. Eli's words echoed in her mind, asterisk. You can't let him own the story. She had spent years running from this moment, years letting the silence and the whispers define her. But she wasn't that person anymore. She had faced the cold and the wind and the hard labor. She had leaned on a good man and had not been let down. She was still standing. Slowly, deliberately. She placed her fork on her plate. The small click was unnaturally loud in the silent room. She pushed her chair back and stood up. The collective gasp was audible. Every face was turned to her, a sea of shock and expectation. Clay Maris looked up, his smirk faltering for the first time, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. May rested her scarred hands on the table, her knuckles white. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear and steady, with an edge of cold steel that cut through the stuffy dining room air. "You are right about one thing, Mr. Maris," she began, her eyes locked on his. "There was a fire in Prosperity, and you were there." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You've left out a few details from your story. You neglected to mention how you tried to force your attentions on a woman who worked for the man who owned that barn. You failed to mention how she refused you, publicly. And you certainly didn't mention the rage of a proud man who has been made to look a fool." Clay's face had gone pale, his charming mask crumbling to reveal the snarling ugliness beneath. "This is hardly the place for the ravings of a hysterical—" "I am not hysterical," May cut in, her voice slicing through his. "I am telling the truth. You got drunk, Mr. Maris, and in your drunken humiliation, you went to that barn and you set a fire, thinking you could burn away your shame and pin the blame on the troublesome woman everyone was already so eager to condemn. You almost succeeded." She let her gaze travel from his face to the faces of the stunned townspeople. She wasn't pleading with them. She wasn't asking for their belief or their pity. She was simply bearing witness to her own life. "I didn't burn that barn," she said, her voice dropping, filled with the weight of 100 lonely nights and 1,000 miles of hard road. "But I did survive the fire." Absolute, profound silence descended on the room. No one moved. No one breathed. The air was thick with the power of her story. A truth so raw and unvarnished it stunned them all. They saw her then, truly saw her for the first time, not as a rumor or a myth, but as a woman who had endured the unthinkable and was still standing. In that dead, charged silence, Eli pushed back his chair and rose to his feet beside her. He didn't look at the mayor or at Clay or at anyone else. He looked only at May. Then, in front of everyone, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers wrapped around hers, a warm, strong, and undeniable anchor in the storm. It was a silent declaration, more powerful than any shout. I believe her. I stand with her. She is not alone. They left the mayor's house without a word, stepping from the suffocating, judgmental warmth back into the clean, honest cold of the night. A sliver of moon hung in the ink-black sky, casting a pale, ghostly light on the snow-covered street. The walk back to the livery, where they had left the horses and wagon, was short, but the silence between them was vast, filled with the unspoken weight of what had just happened. May had expected to feel a sense of triumph, a fierce satisfaction at having finally spoken her truth. Instead, she just felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the effort. The story had been a stone she'd carried for years, and now that she had finally set it down, she felt strangely light, dangerously untethered. Eli walked beside her, his long strides easily matching her own. He didn't speak, didn't offer praise or analysis. He simply walked with her, his presence a solid, comforting wall against the darkness. When they reached the wagon, he placed a hand on her arm, a light touch that stopped her from climbing aboard. "I'll hitch the team," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "You should check on Jasper. Make sure he's settled for the ride back." It was a simple, practical suggestion, but she understood the meaning behind it. He was giving her a moment away from the prying eyes of the town, a moment to breathe in the familiar, calming atmosphere of the stable before the short journey back to the isolation of the ranch. She gave him a grateful nod and turned, her boots making soft thuds on the boardwalk as she headed for the livery doors. The stable was dark, save for a single lantern hanging from a central beam. Its wick turned low. It cast a circle of weak, golden light, leaving the corners and the hayloft in deep, velvety shadow. The air was thick with the scent of hay and animals, a smell that had become synonymous with safety for her. The soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the gentle chewing of cud were a familiar lullaby. She walked down the central aisle toward Jasper's stall. "Easy, boy," she murmured as he nickered a soft greeting, his dark, intelligent eyes watching her approach. She let herself into the stall and ran a hand down his neck, her fingers combing through his coarse mane. He leaned into her touch, his warm breath fogging in the cold air. For a few minutes, she lost herself in the simple, honest connection with the animal, her breathing slowing, the frantic hammering of her heart finally beginning to ease. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that first alerted her, a sound that didn't belong, the soft scuff of a boot on the dirt floor near the main entrance. It wasn't Eli's confident tread. This was furtive, hesitant. Her body went instantly rigid. Her hand fell away from Jasper's neck. She stood perfectly still, her ears straining, trying to place the sound in the vast, breathing darkness. Jasper sensed her tension and shifted uneasily, his ears swiveling toward the door. Another sound, a low, drunken chuckle that slithered out of the shadows. "Well, looky here," a slurred voice said. "The wildcat's all alone." May's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her hand dropping to her hip, her fingers closing around the worn walnut grip of her Colt. 3 figures detached themselves from the shadows near the entrance, moving to block the only way out. In the center, looking rumpled and furious, his city clothes stained with spilled liquor, was Clay Maris. Flanking him were 2 large, brutish men she recognized from the saloon, Tom Finney and another whose name she didn't know. Their faces were flushed with drink, and their eyes held a shared, ugly gleam of malice. "You have a big mouth, May," Clay snarled, his voice losing its polished edge, replaced by a raw, venomous anger. "You embarrassed me. In front of important people, that's not something I forgive. Get out of my way, Clay, May said, her voice low and steady, belying the frantic beat of her heart. She began to draw her pistol, but she knew she was too late. The man on the right lunged. He was fast for a big man, and before she could clear the holster, he had slammed into her, his meaty hand clamping down on her wrist. The Colt clattered to the hay-strewn floor. He twisted her arm behind her back, the pain sharp and blinding. She cried out, a sound of rage more than fear, and drove her heel back into his shin with all her might. He grunted in pain but didn't release her. Hold the little witch, Clay ordered, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he advanced on her. She needs to be taught a lesson about respect. May struggled, bucking and twisting, but the man's grip was like iron. The other man laughed and grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back. Tears of pain sprang to her eyes, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of a scream. She spat in his face. His laughter turned into a roar of fury, and he drew back his hand. The world exploded in a flash of white as his open palm connected with her cheek. Her head snapped to the side, and the taste of copper filled her mouth. The stable seemed to spin around her. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard a new sound, a voice, no longer low and calm, but a crack of thunder that ripped through the stable. Let her go. Eli stood at the entrance, a silhouette against the pale moonlight. He had moved with an impossible, predatory silence. He held no weapon, but he didn't need one. His entire being radiated a cold, lethal fury that was more terrifying than any gun. For a heartbeat, the two thugs froze, surprised by his sudden appearance. Clay, however, just sneered. Row! Always playing the hero. It's 3 against 1. You should have stayed outside. Eli didn't waste another word. He moved. It wasn't a barroom brawl. It was a storm of focused, economic violence. He sidestepped the first man who rushed him, brought his elbow up in a short, brutal arc that connected with the man's jaw, and the thug went down like a sack of grain. The man holding May, startled, loosened his grip for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She stomped down hard on his instep and, as he howled, she drove her head backward into his face. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage, and he staggered back, clutching a broken nose, his hands flying to his face. May scrambled for her pistol, but before she could reach it, Clay Maris was on her. He wasn't a fighter, but he was driven by a spiteful rage. He grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the stall and swung it wildly. May threw herself to the side, the tines gouging deep furrows in the wooden wall where her head had been moments before. Eli was already moving to intercept him, but the first thug had gotten back to his feet, pulling a long skinning knife from his belt. He lunged at Eli from the side. Eli turned, catching the man's wrist, and the two men locked together, a grim dance of muscle and steel. The knife blade flashed in the lantern light. May saw the glint of steel. She saw the second man, the one with the broken nose, shaking his head to clear it, ready to rejoin the fray. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a wooden water bucket, and swung it with all her strength into the side of the man's head. He collapsed without a sound. Eli, meanwhile, slammed the knife-wielding man against a support post. The man's head connected with the heavy timber with a sickening thud. The knife clattered to the ground, but not before its edge had sliced across Eli's forearm, opening a long, deep gash. Blood, dark in the lantern light, welled up instantly, soaking the sleeve of his shirt. Seeing his men down and Eli wounded but still standing, the last of the fight went out of Clay Maris. His face was a mask of terror. He dropped the pitchfork and scrambled backward. "This isn't over! Row!" he shrieked, then turned and fled out the stable doors into the darkness. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of labored breathing and the soft, terrified whickers of the horses. Eli stood with his hand clamped over his bleeding arm, his chest heaving. May rushed to his side, her earlier fear replaced by a cold, sharp focus. "Let me see," she commanded, her voice steady. The sounds of the fight shouts and thuds had carried in the still night air. People were emerging from the saloon and nearby houses, drawn by the commotion. A small crowd, holding lanterns that cast nervous, dancing shadows, gathered at the livery entrance, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They saw the two unconscious men on the ground, the discarded weapons, and Eli, leaning against a post, his arm covered in blood. And they saw May Callahan. She was not weeping. She was not hysterical. Her cheek was already swelling, a dark bruise forming, and a trickle of blood ran from the corner of her lip. But her hands were steady, her eyes clear and fiercely focused, with a clean, sharp motion. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her own dress. "Hold still, Eli," she murmured, her voice a low command. In the full view of the townspeople of Shadow Ridge, the woman they had called Trouble, the woman they had whispered was a demon, a witch, a storm in human form, gently and expertly began to bind the wound of the man who had stood for her. She worked with a practiced efficiency, her scarred fingers tying a firm, clean knot, her touch both competent and strangely tender. Martha O'Connell stood in the crowd, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Jebediah the blacksmith watched, his mouth agape. They had come expecting to see the aftermath of chaos sown by the strange woman. Instead, they were witnessing a scene of quiet, grim courage. They saw not a monster, but a protector. And in that moment, in the flickering lantern light of the bloody stable, they began to see May Callahan differently. The Chinook winds came in the night, a warm, thirsty breath that swept down from the mountains and began its work on the snow. For weeks, the world had been a study in monochrome white snow, black timber, gray sky. Now, color was returning to the valley. The snow receded, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The creeks, freed from their icy prisons, began to sing a boisterous, rushing song. And on the south-facing slopes, the first improbable hints of green appeared. Spring had come to Shadow Ridge, and with it, a profound and palpable sense of change. The town had changed, too. Clay Maris and his hired thugs were gone, having slunk away on the morning stagecoach 2 days after the fight, their plans for the railroad mired in the disgrace of their cowardly attack. Their departure left a vacuum, and into that vacuum flowed the unvarnished truth of what had happened in the livery. The story, told now by the townspeople who had witnessed its aftermath, was no longer a whisper of rumor but a legend of fact. They spoke of Eli Rowe's quiet fury and of the strange woman's fierce, tearless courage. The way they looked at May was different. The hostility was gone, replaced by a mixture of awe, respect, and a certain sheepishness. They had misjudged her so completely. Martha O'Connell, from the general store, had even offered her a small bag of peppermint sticks the last time she was in town, a gesture of apology so clumsy and heartfelt that May had been struck speechless. She hadn't accepted them, but she had nodded her thanks. And for the first time, the woman had met her gaze and smiled a real, if nervous, smile. The occasion for the spring festival was officially to celebrate the thaw and the opening of the pass, but everyone knew it was also something more. It was a celebration of survival, of having weathered not just a hard winter, but a storm of lies and violence. It was a town washing itself clean. Eli had approached her a week before, as they were mending the last of the damaged corral fences. "They're holding a dance in the town square Saturday," he'd said, not looking at her, his attention seemingly focused on stretching a length of wire. Music, food, a town affair. May had paused, a fencing staple held between her lips. A dance, a gathering of people. Her instinct, honed by years of habit, was to refuse, to retreat to the safety of the ranch. But the instinct was weaker now, the habit less compelling. Before she could answer, he'd added, "I went to see Mrs. Gable, the seamstress. She owes me a favor. I asked her to make you something. For the dance. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes steady. It'll be ready Friday. May had taken the staple from her mouth, her fingers suddenly numb. A dress, made for her. It was a gesture of such profound and unexpected thoughtfulness that it stole her breath. It wasn't about changing her or making her into someone she wasn't. It was an invitation, an offering. It was his way of saying, asterisk, you belong here. You have a place. And now, on the evening of the festival, the dress lay on the spare bed. It wasn't a garment of silks or velvets. It was made of a sturdy, deep forest green wool, the color of pines in summer. The cut was simple, practical, but it was tailored with a skill that followed the lines of her body, acknowledging her lean strength rather than trying to hide it. It was a dress for a woman, not a girl, a dress of substance and dignity. As she fastened the last button, she looked at her reflection. The woman staring back was the same, yet different. The haunted look in her eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a pale yellow shadow, a faint reminder of the battle won. But the biggest change was in her posture. For years, she had unconsciously carried herself with her head slightly bowed, her shoulders curved inward, a defensive posture against the world's blows. Now, she stood straight. Her shoulders were back. Her chin was up. She looked taller. Eli was waiting for her in the main room. When she entered, he stopped stirring the fire and simply looked at her. He didn't speak for a long moment. He took in the way the green of the dress complemented the dark sheen of her hair, the way the simple cut emphasized the straight, unbending line of her spine. A slow, genuine smile touched his mouth. "It suits you, May," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you, Eli," she replied, and for the first time, she wasn't just grateful for his actions, but for him. The town square was transformed. Lanterns were strung between the buildings, casting a warm, festive glow that pushed back the encroaching twilight. A long trestle table groaned under the weight of food brought by the town's families. On a makeshift stage, a fiddler and a man with a guitar were playing a lively tune, and a few couples were already circling in a clumsy but joyful dance. The air was filled with the murmur of conversation, laughter, and the smell of roasting meat and pine smoke. When Eli and May stepped into the square, a familiar hush fell over the crowd closest to them. But it was not the hostile silence of her arrival. It was a hush of anticipation, of respect. Heads turned, and a ripple of whispers went through the gathering. May felt the old instinct to shrink, to retreat, but Eli's hand was a warm, steady presence on the small of her back. She took a breath, lifted her chin a little higher, and walked with him toward the center of the celebration. The mayor was the first to greet them, his hand extended to Eli, his eyes full of a new and profound respect for the woman at his side. "Roe, Miss Callahan, glad you could make it." Others followed. People who had once averted their eyes now nodded and smiled. Jebediah, the blacksmith, offered Eli a flask of whiskey and gave May a gruff, approving nod. "Good to see you out, Miss—" It was overwhelming. May felt like a traveler who, after years in a barren desert, had stumbled into a lush valley. She stayed close to Eli's side, a quiet anchor in the swirl of unfamiliar social warmth. After they had eaten, the fiddler struck up a slower tune, a simple, heartfelt waltz. The music drifted through the square, a melancholy and beautiful sound that spoke of long winters and the promise of spring. Eli turned to her, the lantern light catching the serious, kind expression in his eyes. "May," he said, holding out his hand, "dance with me." Her heart leaped into her throat. To dance, here, in front of everyone. It was the final, public step out of the shadows. It was terrifying. She looked at his outstretched hand, large, calloused. The hand of a man who worked and fought and built things, the same hand that had taken hers in the mayor's dining room. She placed her own scarred hand in his. He led her to the open space that served as a dance floor. The other couples moved back slightly, giving them room. Every eye in Shadow Ridge was on them. Eli put one hand on her waist, and she rested her other on his broad shoulder. His grip was firm, confident. She was not a natural dancer. Her life had offered few opportunities for such graces. Her movements were stiff, uncertain at first. "Just follow me," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "Listen to the music. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. She focused on his eyes, on the steady rhythm of his voice, on the solid strength of his body leading hers. Slowly, the stiffness in her limbs began to melt away. She stopped thinking about the steps and started to feel the music. She stopped being aware of the dozens of watching eyes and became aware only of him. They moved together, not with the polished grace of city dancers, but with a solid, grounded harmony. He was the sturdy oak, and she was the wind that moved with him, no longer a destructive gale, but a steady, sure current. In that moment, under the lanterns and the vast, star-dusted sky, they were the quiet, unshakable center of the world. Standing near the food table, Martha O'Connell watched them, her arms crossed. Her husband, Silas, came to stand beside her. "He looks happy," Silas observed, chewing on a piece of pie. Martha didn't take her eyes off the couple circling in the center of the square. She watched the way May looked at Eli, with a trust so profound it was heartbreaking. She remembered her own harsh judgments, the whispers she had started and encouraged, and she saw the woman May was now straight-backed, courageous, and fiercely loyal. She saw how the town, which had been stagnant with suspicion and petty grudges, had been shaken up, forced to look at itself and the truth, all because this woman had ridden in on a storm. She gave a small, slow shake of her head, a quiet marvel in her expression. "She may be trouble," Martha whispered, more to herself than to her husband. "But maybe that's just what we needed." The morning after the festival, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. It was a different kind of silence than the one May had grown accustomed to. It wasn't the silence of loneliness or the tense, watchful silence of two strangers. It was a deep, comfortable quiet, the kind that exists between two people who no longer need words to understand one another. The town square was a memory of laughter and light. Now, there was only the familiar rhythm of the ranch. May rose before dawn, the simple wool dress carefully folded away, her practical work clothes a familiar comfort. She found Eli already by the fire pit, a pot of coffee brewing, its rich, dark aroma a welcome greeting in the chill morning air. He passed her a cup without a word, and she accepted it, their hands brushing in a fleeting, easy gesture of familiarity. Life had found its groove. The days were spent on the endless, honest tasks of a working ranch. They rode the fence lines together, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the steady hoofbeats of their horses a conversation in itself. They worked side by side, mending what the winter had broken, preparing for the new growth of spring. May found a fierce satisfaction in the work, in the feeling of her muscles burning with effort, in the tangible results of her labor. She was not just a guest or a hired hand anymore. She was a part of the place. Her sweat and skill were in the sturdy roof of the stable, in the straight, taut lines of the new fences. One afternoon, a few weeks after the dance, they rode up to the high ridge that overlooked the valley. It was the same ridge that had funneled the winter storm into the town, the same ridge that gave Shadow Ridge its name. From up here, the town was a collection of tiny, toy-like buildings, a small pocket of civilization carved out of a vast and indifferent wilderness. The roads leading out of the valley, once impassable rivers of mud and snow, were now dry and clear, pale ribbons winding their way east and west into the unknown. They were open. They were waiting. They dismounted, letting the horses graze on the new spring grass. They stood together on the overlook, a cool breeze tugging at their hair. The world spread out at their feet. The air was so clear it felt like you could see forever. It smelled of damp earth, of pine needles warming in the sun, and from the valley below, the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke from the town's chimneys. May breathed it all in. This was the scent of a place that had endured. The town, like her, was scarred. It was stubborn. It was imperfect. It had judged her and condemned her, but it had also, in its own grudging way, made room for her. It was a place that had weathered a storm and was still standing. She felt an unexpected, fierce surge of kinship with the stubborn little settlement. For a long time, she had thought of the road as her only home. The freedom to ride away, to leave trouble behind, had been her only real possession. The sight of a clear road had always been a siren's call, a promise of a clean slate just over the next horizon. But she knew now that you couldn't outride the storm inside you. You could only turn and face it, and she had faced it here, in this valley, with this quiet, steady man by her side. Eli had been watching her, his expression thoughtful. He had seen the way she looked at the open roads, a flicker of the old, restless traveler in her eyes. The work on the ranch was done. The unspoken terms of their arrangement had been fulfilled. The question of her future, a silent guest that had been living with them for weeks, finally needed to be given a voice. He broke the comfortable silence, his voice gentle, careful not to spook a wild thing, still planning to ride off when the road's clear. The question was simple, direct, and it held the weight of everything that had passed between them. He wasn't asking her to stay. He wasn't trapping her with obligation or expectation. He was giving her the one thing she had always valued most, a choice, the freedom to leave. And in doing so, he was giving her the only reason she might ever have to stay. May didn't answer right away. She turned her gaze from the distant roads back to the valley. She saw the glint of the creek, the solid, reassuring shape of his ranch house and the stable she had helped rebuild. She thought of Jasper, safe in his stall. She thought of the solid feel of a well-balanced hammer in her hand. She thought of the surprising warmth of a sheepskin coat on a cold night, of the steady presence of a man who looked at her and saw not trouble, but a survivor. She thought of the years she had spent running, believing that to stop moving was to be caught, to be broken. But here, in this place, she had stopped, and she had not been broken. She had been seen. She had been respected. She had fought, and she had healed. She had danced. The road was a lonely kind of freedom, but perhaps, she thought, there was another kind. The freedom to choose a piece of ground and stand on it. The freedom to build something instead of just surviving. The freedom to face the next storm without having to face it alone. She finally turned her head to look at him. The breeze caught a loose strand of her hair, whipping it across her face. He waited, his gray eyes patient, ready for her answer, whatever it might be. No, she whispered, the word feeling both strange and right on her tongue. She looked back at the sky, at the valley, at the whole wounded, beautiful world they occupied. I think I'll stay. A small, almost imperceptible tremor of relief went through him. She smiled then, a small, wry curve of her lips that was entirely her own, at least till the next storm. A slow grin spread across Eli's face. It was a gentle, knowing smile, full of a quiet understanding that went deeper than words. He heard what she was truly saying. He knew her promise of till the next storm was the most honest and binding vow she could make. It was her version of forever. And for the first time, with the clear spring sky above them and the solid earth beneath her feet, May Callahan looked at him and smiled back. It was not the thin, bitter smirk of defiance he had seen in the saloon. It was a real smile, a small, hesitant dawn of a thing, but it reached her eyes, and it filled them with a light that was brighter than the sun. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let us know what part of the world you're in. Feel free to share your thoughts on May and Eli's journey. If you enjoyed this tale, Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by pressing the hype button. Your support means the world to us.